Everyone assumed he was just another quiet rancher, harmless and out of place, until the HOA fenced him in. But the truth was, they had no idea who he was. Imagine waking up one morning to find that the land you've worked, protected, and cherished has been caged off, not by strangers from a distant town, but by the very people who share your neighborhood. This wasn't a simple disagreement about property lines. It was a calculated move, a message, wrapped in the cold steel of a locked fence. And for Marcus Green, a proud black rancher whose family had lived on that land for 3 generations, it was more than a personal insult. It was a battle over dignity, history, and the right to simply exist with pride. Marcus was a man who carried silence like armor. His neighbors, mostly wealthy families who had recently moved into the area, often whispered about him. Some said he was too quiet, others assumed he couldn't afford the land he lived on, and a few went as far as to call his ranch an eyesore compared to their manicured lawns and glossy driveways. They saw an outsider, someone who didn't fit into their gated ideal of suburban perfection. But what they didn't see, what they refused to see, was the history carved into every wooden post of his ranch. That land was more than soil. It was sweat. It was struggle. It was survival. His grandfather, once a sharecropper, had worked through impossible odds to purchase those acres during a time when black ownership of land was met with suspicion, hostility, and sometimes violence. His father had defended it through recessions and droughts, and Marcus, though often underestimated, carried their legacy in the way he tilled, repaired, and nurtured the earth beneath his boots. But legacy didn't matter to the HOA. To them, Marcus was a nuisance, someone who didn't follow their endless lists of rules. He refused to paint his barn neutral beige. He wouldn't cut down the oak trees his grandfather had planted, and he certainly wasn't about to ask permission to graze his horses on his land. Their patience with him had worn thin, and one spring morning they showed him just how far they were willing to go. It started with the sound of hammering. Marcus stepped outside, confused to see trucks lined up along the road. Men in reflective vests unloaded heavy posts and rolls of wire mesh. Within hours, a fence began stretching across his land. Not around his neighbors' homes, not in the common areas, but around his ranch alone. A fence that cut across his driveway, sealing him in. And at the entrance stood a single iron gate. He walked over calmly, his boots crunching on gravel, and asked the workers what they thought they were doing. They shrugged. Just following orders. The orders had come from the HOA board, a group of neighbors who, behind closed doors, had decided that Marcus's land disrupted the community's aesthetic and needed containment. That word, containment, would stick with him. It wasn't about fences. It was about power. Marcus's hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't yell or demand they stop, because Marcus had learned something his father once told him. Never fight a man where he's strongest. Make him fight where he's weak. And at that moment, the HOA's strength was intimidation. But their weakness? Ownership. That night, as Marcus sat at his old wooden kitchen table, he unfolded the property maps and deed papers he had kept carefully stored away. He read every line, every detail, with a focused calm. And when he found what he was looking for, a small clause buried in the legal description of shared land ownership, a plan began to form. It was bold. It was risky. But it was his way of turning their cage into his freedom. Unbeknownst to the HOA, the narrow strip of land where they had built the gate didn't fully belong to them. It had been classified decades earlier as a shared access easement, a small overlooked patch technically available for private purchase. Over the years, no one had cared to claim it, until now. Marcus called a lawyer the very next morning. The conversation was short and professional, but his intentions were clear. Within weeks, paperwork was filed, signatures notarized, and a transaction quietly completed. The land beneath that gate, the gate the HOA had built to lock him in, was now his, and with it came the only legal right to the key. When the HOA board discovered this, they were stunned. Their smug confidence dissolved into frustration. They called meetings, wrote angry letters, and even tried to intimidate Marcus into relinquishing his newly purchased strip of land. But Marcus never raised his voice, never threatened, never stooped to their level. He simply carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who knew he had won without ever throwing a punch. One afternoon, the HOA president, a man who had often spoken about Marcus with thinly veiled disdain, stormed up to his gate. "You can't do this!" he shouted. "This is community property!" Marcus looked at him calmly, resting his hands on the top rail of the gate. "Community property?" he asked. "Funny, because the deed in my pocket says otherwise." He pulled out a folded copy of the purchase document, the county seal stamped clearly at the bottom. The president's face turned red with anger, but there was nothing he could do. From that day forward, if anyone in the neighborhood wanted to use the road that passed through Marcus's land, they had to go through him. And Marcus, who had been treated like an outsider, a man to be caged and ignored, now held the only key. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very fence meant to isolate him had become the symbol of his authority. The gate that was supposed to trap him had become the door through which the entire community had to pass. But for Marcus, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about lording power over his neighbors. It was about standing firm in the face of disrespect and reclaiming the dignity his family had fought generations to preserve. And as he stood by that gate, watching the sun dip behind the oak trees his grandfather planted, he knew he had done more than win a battle. He had taught them a lesson they would never forget. Never underestimate the man you try to fence in. For a while, the neighborhood simmered in uneasy silence. Some avoided eye contact with Marcus entirely, ashamed or perhaps embarrassed by the way they had treated him. Others doubled down on their resentment, whispering behind closed doors, crafting new ways to pressure him. But none of them could deny a simple, unavoidable fact. The man they once thought they could push aside now stood as the gatekeeper, literally and figuratively, of their community. Marcus didn't revel in their discomfort. He wasn't the kind of man who celebrated someone else's humiliation, but deep inside, there was a quiet satisfaction, the kind born from knowing you didn't just defend yourself, you defended the memory of everyone who came before you. He thought of his grandfather, who once said, "Land is the only thing they can't take from you if you hold on tight enough." That old man had walked the same soil, bent over the same earth, often under the gaze of those who wished he'd fail. Marcus's victory wasn't just for him. It was for his grandfather, who had dreamed of freedom, his father who had protected it with calloused hands, and for his children who would inherit something that was more than land. It was a legacy wrapped in pride. The HOA wasn't done fighting. They filed complaints with the county, tried to argue that Marcus's ownership of the strip was illegitimate, and even attempted to force new restrictions on his ranch. Every letter that arrived carried the same venom, masked in legal jargon, but Marcus faced it all with patience. Each time, his lawyer reminded the HOA of the ironclad deed, shutting down their claims one by one, and with each failed attempt, their power crumbled. But something else began happening, something the HOA hadn't expected. Slowly, a few neighbors started to notice Marcus differently. They saw the way he woke up before dawn to feed his horses, how he repaired his fences with his own hands, how he worked the land not out of obligation, but out of love. Some even began to question the HOA's motives. Was this really about community standards, or had they been complicit in something uglier, something rooted in the quiet prejudice they'd chosen to ignore? One neighbor, a woman named Claire, mustered the courage to knock on Marcus's door one afternoon. She admitted she had never spoken to him before, though they had lived only a half-mile apart for years. "I was wrong," she confessed softly. "I believed what they said about you. I thought you were stubborn, unwilling to cooperate. But I see now. You just wanted to live your life. You didn't deserve what they did to you." Marcus listened, quietly, then nodded. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do after." His words carried no bitterness, no rage. Only the weight of someone who understood forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it could build a better future. Soon, a few more neighbors followed Claire's lead. Some asked Marcus for advice on their gardens or livestock. Others offered to help when storms damaged parts of his property. Slowly, the barrier of fear and prejudice began to crumble. The gate that once symbolized separation has now become a place of unexpected connection. But the HOA leadership remained stubborn. They still saw Marcus as a threat to their control. In one final desperate act, they tried to organize a vote to raise community dues and use the funds to buy back the gate strip from him. Their arrogance assumed Marcus might be tempted by money, but they were dead wrong. When word reached Marcus, he didn't laugh, didn't mock them. He simply attended the meeting, stood at the front, and spoke for the first time to the entire group. His voice was steady, firm, but filled with emotion. "My family has been on this land for nearly 100 years, he began. "Before any of these houses, before your HOA, before your rules. This ranch was here. My grandfather worked this land when people said a black man couldn't own a single acre. My father defended it when banks tried to take it from us. And I stand here today, not just for me, but for them. This land isn't for sale, not now, not ever." The room fell silent. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others felt a surge of respect they hadn't expected. Marcus's words weren't just about property. They were about belonging, about dignity, about the unshakable right to stand tall in a world that too often tried to push him down. From that day forward, the HOA's war against him lost steam. They knew they couldn't outmatch his resolve. The legal battles fizzled, the whispers died down, and even those who disliked him came to accept one truth: Marcus wasn't going anywhere. In time, his story spread beyond the neighborhood. A local reporter wrote about the rancher who turned the tables on an HOA by buying the land under their gate. The article went viral, capturing the imagination of thousands. To many, Marcus became a symbol, not of defiance for its own sake, but of the quiet power in standing your ground when everything is against you. For young black men and women who read his story, Marcus was proof that dignity wasn't something anyone could fence off. That history and pride, when rooted deeply enough, could withstand the strongest attempts to erase them. One evening, as Marcus closed the gate and locked it with the key that was now his alone, he thought about how life had changed. Not long ago, he had felt like an outsider in his community. Now, though not everyone had embraced him, he had carved out something more important: respect. And not just respect from others, but respect for himself, for his ancestors, and for the unbreakable bond between a man and the land he calls home. The oak trees swayed gently in the breeze, their roots deep in the soil, planted by his grandfather's hands. Marcus smiled faintly, knowing those roots were more than just wood and earth. They were the roots of legacy, resilience, and a truth the HOA could never fence in. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not the legal win, not the gate key, but the unshakable reminder to the world: you cannot contain a man whose spirit was born free, because sometimes the fences built to hold you back only prove how far you've already come.